Thank you all for coming. Thank you for that lovely welcome. I also want to pay a particular tribute to Holocaust Educational Trust Ireland for their graciousness in having me back for a second year in a row. Each time I come, I see a little more of your wonderful country. So give me about 10 years and I should be ready, to have seen it all. There are a couple of seats. If you have an empty seat next to you, why don't you raise your hand? Because there are some people standing in the back, and it would be nice. So there's, okay, that one isn't there, but there are two down here.
No, these are taken.
They're taken. Oh, I don't. Very skinny people. Okay. What I'd like to do today, as I was consulting with one of my colleagues from our seminar, is really give you two lectures in one, which either will work fabulously well or will leave you dissatisfied on both accounts. But I know some of you, you indicated as I came in or before I got here, that you were looking forward to hearing me talk about my trial, the libel case brought against me, the libel action brought against me by David Irving. I stress that because you cannot imagine how many people assumed that I had brought the case against him, which I would not have done. And at the same time, to set that within the context of Holocaust denial itself. So let me start with the latter. Let me start with laying out for you what the basic premise of Holocaust denial is, and the two different trends that I see in Holocaust denial. I'm not alone in this, and then bring that into the action, the legal action brought against me. Now, one of the things we have to be certain about is that, or clear about, is that not all deniers share the same belief or make the same arguments, but there's certain points that are common to all of them. And to go through them very quickly, that neither Hitler nor the Nazi leadership had a program, a plan of annihilating European Jewry. At the worst, all they wished to do was to make Germany Judenrein, and make Germany free, empty of Jews. That the idea of a genocide is an invented notion, invented by Allied propaganda, which was largely Jewish and in particular Zionist, to serve propaganda purposes, to make Jews rich at the expense of Germany, and to justify a Jewish state. Let me just briefly, and I do this very briefly so I can't quite do it justice, but on those last 2 points, making Jews rich and justifying a Jewish state, those two claims fit precisely, as does all of Holocaust denial, but fit precisely into the stereotypical elements of the anti-Semitic or the elements of the anti-Semitic stereotype, that Jews are rich, Jews are conniving, Jews will go to great lengths to get whatever they want, even when it is at the expense of a large majority. And so this kind of claim makes sense, so to speak, to the person who is the least bit predisposed to anti-Semitic stereotypes. They also argue that, yes, some Jews may have died. This is particularly important for David Irving, but Hitler had no role in any of this. The attempt is to whitewash, to not only paint this as a Jewish cabal, a Jewish charge against an innocent country, Germany, but also to whitewash Hitler, and by so doing, whitewash as much as possible National Socialism, Nazism. Of course, they also argue that the number of Jews who were killed, if there were any killed, more often they use the word died. Language is very important here. They will use the word died, not killed. It is far smaller than the 6 million number that is usually given. Ironically, as I was just saying to a reporter yesterday, we now know from recent research that's been done at Sobibor, research that's been done in Belarus, in the Ukraine, that it's very likely, and research done in opened archives after the fall of the Soviet Union, when for a brief shining moment the archives were actually available to scholars, and that many are no longer, that it may be actually more than 6 million, but that's tentative at the moment. And then, of course, that the notion of gas chambers is something that was fabricated after the war, and that gas chambers are an invention and could should never have operated. Periodically, you will get deniers backtracking, then coming forward and taking all sorts of different stands, but those are the essence of their arguments. What's their objective? Their objective is to enter the conversation as a quote-unquote other side of the discussion, to be taken legitimately, even if most people will not agree with them, that theirs is a quote-unquote point of view that deserves airing, that deserves serious consideration. And I'll talk about why this objective doesn't really work, given their the so-called evidence they propose. But that in a moment. Now, of course, they face a very large conundrum. If the Holocaust is indeed a hoax, why does post-war Germany accept responsibility for it? You would think that they would not accept responsibility for this terrible thing. But the deniers have an answer to that. Because of the Jews, greats, and the Allies, and of course the Jews controlled the Allies, great success in spreading this notion of the Holocaust, in order for Germany to be fully accepted back into the nations of man, or however you want it, the humanity, the world's civilized nations, a family of civilized nations, they had to acknowledge their guilt. This would be somehow akin to the person who is charged with a terrible crime, rape, abuse of children, and even though they didn't do it, the only way they're going to get any mercy from the court is by acknowledging it and saying, oh, I did a wrong thing, and then the court might be more lenient to them. But if the person stands there and insists on their innocence when everything looks like they are guilty, they will get no sympathy. So that this was way of Germany's success, and they point at the success of Germany, post-war success of Germany, and say, obviously the Germans got it right. Again, I think it's very important, and maybe this is something I really should have started with, to recognize that at its heart, and maybe I don't even have to qualify it, just say Holocaust denial is naught but a form of anti-Semitism. That it fits the stereotype, as I mentioned earlier, power, money. It is a way of denigrating Jews. It is a way of painting Jews as conniving operatives, etc. Now, sometimes it is more than just anti-Semitism. Very often, in many groups, it is also overt racism. In my country, and I know many other countries too, we have an expert here on Germany, I know it's the case there as well, racist white supremacist groups will often say, whenever we want to argue about the racial superiority, let's make believe we don't hear that noise, okay? Whenever we want to argue about the racial superiority of white people, we are told that is Nazi science, and that led to the Holocaust. So, ipso facto, the myth, this is the racist talking, the white supremacist talking, the myth of the Holocaust is used to keep us from making the argument that whites are racially superior. The tactics that deniers will use, of course, is to claim that they have significant evidence to prove their case. This document shows this, and this document shows that. And this takes me back to my trial itself. As was noted in the introduction, and as I stressed in my opening words, David Irving brought a libel suit against me in the United Kingdom, in England, for calling him a Holocaust denier. It was something I had done in my first book on Holocaust denial, presented in 1993. I devoted a few pages to David Irving. I said he was a Holocaust denier. I said he was the most dangerous of deniers because, unlike other deniers, he had a certain status as a writer of historical works. When he wrote a book, it would very likely be reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement, the Irish Review of Books, the New York Times, New York Review of Books. It was taken seriously, even if people disagreed with it. For example, his book in the late 70s Hitler's War, which he described as a biography of the war, Hitler's biography of Hitler from his own perspective, as if I'm standing, he said, I as the author stand behind Hitler's desk and write what he saw and what he did. So in the first edition of that book, he argues that Hitler, this is before he becomes a denier, Hitler didn't know about the Holocaust, and when he found out about it, he tried to stop it, and he was, quote unquote, the best friend the Jews had in Germany, with friends like that. But in any case, so later, he will become a Holocaust denier in the late 80s, and it's then that in that interim period, his reputation begins to ebb, and it is possible that he makes that decision to become a denier because it is a way of getting publicity. I used to live in Los Angeles, and the operative phrase there was, I don't care what, in the Hollywood, in the film industry, I don't care what they say about me as long as they spell my name correctly. So he wanted the attention. I don't know if that's the case. I can only surmise on that. But he would claim, he knows the documents very well. He's a very energetic researcher, and he would claim to have these documents to prove indeed that there were no gas chambers, that the Jews were never murdered, that the mass killings on the Eastern Front were a myth, et cetera, and that in many different instances, Hitler tried to protect the Jews. So when he sued me for libel, we made a decision together with my legal team, and I had a very fine legal team, which is often pointed out as showing that this was an inherently unfair trial because David Irving represented himself. There were many lawyers who stepped forward who would have been willing to represent him. The court could have appointed one. But he wanted to represent himself. That was his choice. He said so. He said so on the opening day of the trial. No one could present this case better than I. Well, if that was the case, in any case. What we decided right from the beginning, I say we, it was really my lawyers, and I acquiesced. I had very fine lawyers, Anthony Julius as my solicitor, Richard Rampton, my barrister, was that should this case come to trial, we would try our very hardest to ensure that it not become a did the Holocaust happen trial. You do not have trials questioning, did World War II happen, did the Korean War, did whatever war you want to cite happen? Why would you have a trial such as this? But rather that the lawyers would adopt a standard operating procedure for a libel trial, and essentially say David Irving is accusing Deborah Lipstadt of libeling him when she called him a Holocaust denier. Therefore, our objective is to prove that he is indeed a Holocaust denier. In essence, if you parachuted into that courtroom without knowing anything about the background of the case that was going on, you might well have thought that was the case, because by doing that, and it's again standard operating procedure, I have since learned for libel trials, you put the person bringing the case, remember I'm the defendant, he's the plaintiff or the claimant, but you put the claimant or the plaintiff on trial because you say, no, this is what we're saying, my client was correct, she told the truth, and we're going to prove that indeed she told the truth. How did we determine to do that? We determined to do that not by calling Holocaust survivors, and there were many Holocaust survivors who stepped forward, who were anxious to give testimony, and we said to them, no, we're not calling people survivors. We didn't explain why, and some people were clearly miffed, to use a I don't know the term used here, but put off because they thought we were dismissing them or denigrating them. In fact, the reason we did not, there were a number of reasons why we didn't call Holocaust deniers. Holocaust survivors as witnesses in a Holocaust denial trial. They would have been witnesses of fact as opposed to expert witnesses. And calling witnesses of fact would have suggested to the judge that we felt we needed to prove the facts of the Holocaust when we felt we didn't need to prove. We didn't want to get into that of proving the facts because we felt they stood on their own, A. B, there are, deniers don't deny that Jews might have been in camps, might have even suffered in camps. Of course, what they will say, they're always flipping it around and turning the victim into the perpetrator and the Germans into the victims. What they will say is that Germany put the Jews in concentration camps for their own protection, because this is what they say, the German populace was so hostile to them because of the bombings. Now, of course, what the Jews had to do with the bombings, by the Allies, that don't confuse me with the facts. We won't worry about that. And the Germans took very good care of them in these camps until the Allies bombed the German infrastructure, the pharmaceutical factories, the food production factories, farms, roads leading to the camps, and the Germans could not take proper care of the people in the camps, and that is why when the camps were open, the people looked more like cadavers than like human beings. Of course, it doesn't explain why the Germans, German non-Jews, living in the areas around the camps looked very healthy and very well fed, but again, that's a small detail. So that they will make that point again, saying that it's the Germans who were the victims, and the Germans, in fact, were trying to take care of the Jews. But the fact of the matter is, also going back to why we didn't call survivors, is that there are very few survivors alive who actually saw the killing process. Very few of the Sonderkommandos, very few survived. Some did survive. But by the time of my trial, there were virtually none alive who could have come and given testimony. And it's the killing process about which the deniers make their case. But most importantly, we didn't call survivors because, or no, most importantly, but one of the reasons was that David Irving was acting as a litigant in person. He was pro se. And we did not want to win this case by putting an elderly person, a survivor of the Holocaust, into the witness box to be cross-examined by a man whose motive we assumed would be to confuse them, to humiliate them, whatever. And it's easy to confuse someone. You say you arrived on April 14th, 1944, or May 14th, 1944 at Auschwitz, and your family was immediately taken to be killed. We have documents here showing that on that day the gas chambers were not operating, or the crematoria were not operating. Maybe it was the next day, maybe it was the day before, etc. So they would not have been expert witnesses, but witnesses of fact, thereby indicating to the court we thought the Holocaust had to be proven, and also we didn't want that confrontation. Instead, we did something which turned out to be a brilliant move, and it was not my idea, so I can say that. We assembled literally a dream team of historians, led by Richard Evans of Cambridge, joined by Christopher Browning of the University of North Carolina. Some of you know your Holocaust history, so you'll know these names. Joined by Robert Jan van Pelt from Toronto, who's done seminal work on the history of Auschwitz. Joined by Peter Longerich of Germany and of England, and by Hayo Funke of Berlin, who was a specialist in extremism. And each of them took a different piece of Irving's work, and what they did essentially was follow the footnotes. They followed the footnotes back to their sources. So when this morning the people at the Holocaust Educational Trust got... come with my own water. Not from the United States. I trust your water. I trust you. Not much. No, that's not true. Got a long email saying that Holocaust, so-called Holocaust historians such as Deborah Lipstadt don't believe in looking at the sources, don't believe in an open examination of the material. That's, of course, complete gobbledygook. It's just not true. What we did is when we tracked back to David Irving's sources, we found not, and this is to paraphrase Richard Evans, Professor Evans, Sir Richard Evans, we found not in most cases, and not in the preponderance of cases, and not in the majority of cases, but in every single instance where he made reference to the Holocaust, there was a distortion, there was an invention. It was, and this is a quote from Richard Evans, a tissue of lies. Let me just give you two examples. One actually deals with not only pre the Holocaust, but pre the Nazis coming to power. It takes place in 1923 during the Putsch, the failed Nazi attempt to overthrow the Weimar government. As you know, Hitler is arrested and put on trial. Now, according to David Irving, a police sergeant had testified at Hitler's trial, there's a trial in Hitler's that Hitler, during the night of the Putsch, this police sergeant is giving this testimony this is David Irving's version. On the night of the Putsch, Hitler, incensed by the ransacking and looting of a Jewish delicatessen, sent for the ex-army lieutenant who had led the raid and dismissed him on the spot. Hitler was told that young man over there just led a raid and ransacked and destroyed a Jewish delicatessen. Hitler called him over and said, I'm throwing you out of the Nazi party, and I will see that no other nationalist unit allows you to join either. Then Irving goes on to write that Hermann Göring, apparently amazed at Hitler's admonishment to the looter, goggled at this exchange. David Irving then gives as a footnote to this exchange the 6,000-page trial testimony of Hitler's trial. Now, right away, even to the student, the high school student, pre-university student who is doing research, that should set off red warning signs, because if you're citing if you're saying Hitler was put on trial, and there was a very long trial, and you cite the 6,000-page transcript, that's exactly fitting. But if you're citing an incident from the trial, you don't say, and here are the 6,000 pages. If you're interested to see it in an original, flip through them and you'll find them. And David Irving said, well, maybe I had to look at it. He didn't say I had to look at it in microfiche. He said, well, maybe I had to look at it in microfiche or microfilm. So my barrister said, so give a date. Give something that will help the person wanting to see your sources check them out. That's what footnotes are all about. Well, we had as our secret weapons, we had three very fine researchers. Some of them have gone on to important academic careers, and they began to go through the testimony. And they found something a little bit different from the way David Irving presented it. First of all, this police officer giving testimony about Hitler's upset about the ransacking of the delicatessen was actually a former police officer, a man named Hoffmann, who was one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party at a very low, I think it's a 2 or 3 digit membership number. This is one of the first members. Now, why is that important? Because you're citing testimony given by someone who is not an adversary of Hitler. In other words, he's not a police officer who came in to arrest Hitler, but he's a supporter of Hitler. And in fact, he was such a strong supporter of Hitler that the judge turned to him in the 1923 trial and said, it's very good of you to come and give testimony on behalf of your Führer, but you're so close that I have to disallow your testimony. And what does this police sergeant say? This police sergeant says, first of all, that Hitler had sacked the lieutenant. It's true Hitler had sacked the lieutenant, but not for raiding the delicatessen. He sacked him because he removed his party insignia before the raid so that people who saw them trashing the delicatessen would not know they were from the Nazi Party. Number one. Number two, the raid did not take place that night. It's not as if Hitler had stopped and said, oh, I heard this raid the raid had taken place 3 weeks before, and he just happened to encounter the lieutenant that night. He didn't send for him. He didn't say, bring me the lieutenant. The lieutenant happened to be there, and someone had said that this had gone on. So instead, Irving makes it sound like Hitler had aggressively gone to punish this lieutenant on the night of directing a putsch when, in fact, he hadn't done that. Moreover, there's no mention of Göring goggling at this exchange. So when my barrister asked David Irving, how do you know that Göring was present or that he goggled? And this is a quote. Irving declared, that was author's license. And my barrister responded, you mean it was an invention, a piece of fiction? And then Irving, sounded very much like he was lecturing, Rampton said, quote, when you write a book that is going to be read, you occasionally help the reader along. Here is Hitler ticking off an army lieutenant, one of his Nazis, for raiding a Jewish shop and throwing him out of the party for doing so. You would imagine that any other Nazi like Göring standing nearby is going to be doing a double take, or am I wrong? And my barrister didn't waste a minute. He said, you're completely wrong, Mr. Irving. So, you know, this is how a fiction writer who wants to maybe root his work in a demi part of history might write, but this is not how a historian writes. And we found this consistently. We found this in relation to Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, November 38, where David Irving portrays Hitler as having tried to stop the destruction that was going on. He quotes a telex that goes out, and he says that, I think, 1:36 in the morning, night of the Kristallnacht, and he says to the effect that the telex said, stop the madness, that Hitler was livid with rage, and he wanted this destruction stopped. Well, if you look at the actual telex, which our researchers found and brought to our experts, you will see that the telex says, stop the arson against Jewish shops and the like must be halted. Why were they wanting to stop the arson? Because they were getting reports from all over Germany, from fire departments, from mayors, from whatever, saying that you're burning the synagogues, but fire doesn't know when to stop at the edges of the synagogue, and it's burning up whole blocks, and the fire departments cannot control what is going on. So it wasn't an instruction to stop the attacks, it was an announcement to stop the one form of the attacks. So you had that kind of thing. The third example I want to give you actually takes place during the war itself. Hitler and Ribbentrop in April of 1943, I think it's on the 15th and 16th, or 16th and 17th, have a meeting with Admiral Horthy, the head of the Hungarian government. Now, the Hungarians had instituted many, many anti-Semitic rules, regulations, legislation, but they had refused to allow the Jews to be deported. Now, this is already late in the war, and they're not inclined to do it either, but Ribbentrop and Hitler meet with Horthy to press him to do it. And there's a transcript of the meeting. And the first day of the meeting, Horthy says, what do you expect me to do to allow the Jews to be deported, to die like beasts in the field? And Hitler says, no, that's not necessary. On the second day of the meeting, Horthy asks the same question again, and Hitler launches into, a harangue that I'm going to try to find the exact quote, but essentially, blood is dripping from every word. The Jews are like tuberculous bacilli. If they're not killed now, they will bring down others. Even if the baby animal has a disease, you must kill the baby, because otherwise it will grow into an adult. Blood is dripping from every word of his harangue. Ribbentrop says at the same time, right before Hitler's harangue, in fact, I think it is, the Jews must be taken to concentration camps and allowed to die, annihilated or taken to concentration camps. So how does David Irving handle that exchange, which is so clear of what's going on? First of all, he switches the days, the sequence. So he quotes Hitler's harangue, but he puts it on the first day. And he takes Hitler's comment saying, no, it's not necessary to deport them, and he puts it on the second day. So just by switching sequence, I very often do this with my students. I say, take an article from the newspaper, any article, and just change the meaning by switching sequence of paragraphs. And they all think it's going to be very difficult, and they find out it's not difficult at all. So he changes the sequence of it. Number one, he buries Ribbentrop's statement, which is quite a strong statement, annihilated or taken to concentration camps and allowed to die. He buries that in a footnote. But then he goes on to say, he goes on to say that this, of course, in his own voice, very often when you write a book, or not very often, you should, when you want to write a book, you want to figure out what's going to be difficult to your readers and anticipate that and sort of explain. So he's explaining why Hitler was so intent on seeing that the Jews were deported. And he says, because of course, this was the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, where I think he says 100,000, I remember exactly, 30,000, a very large number, of course, far more than the Jews who actually took part in the revolt, were rising up against the Nazis with arms provided to them by troops retreating from the east. And that Hitler said to Horthy, let Poland be a lesson to you. What happens if you don't get rid of the Jews? Now, first of all, I don't know what troops retreating from the east were stopping at the Warsaw Ghetto and providing the fighters with their arms, but that's beside the point. It's a far smaller number. But most importantly, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising begins 2 days after this meeting. And it was not like it was scheduled that Hitler knew in 2 days we're having the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. I mean, it was a complete surprise to the Germans. So Hitler's pushing Horthy to do this has no connection to the Warsaw Ghetto. And when we confronted David Irving with this in the courtroom, Irving said, "Oh, it was just a mix-up of dates." And of course, what we pointed out to him, what Rampton pointed out to him as a result of the research done for the trial, that Martin Brojat, the very famous and prominent historian of the Holocaust, German historian of the Holocaust from the Institute for Zeitgeschichte, had pointed out this mix-up to Irving in 1977, and he hadn't corrected any of it in subsequent editions of the book. So what kept happening during our trial was that David Irving, when he was boxed in, our only strategy was to box him in with the facts. And that's what denial is, what you do to deniers. You just show them the facts, because none of these so-called facts that they have hold up when put under the examination line, which is one of the reasons, by the way, at least, and I would say that Germany, Austria, Poland may be exceptions, why I personally am against laws outlawing Holocaust denial, because it suggests we don't have the information, we don't have the facts to confront them, which we certainly do. So to argue that I'm arguing to claim, as this denier who sent in this email, a local denier said, that I'm claiming for a certain orthodoxy is just silly. I want to make one more point before I'm going to stop to allow some time for questions. What I've been discussing here is really what David Irving represents and other deniers like him, what you hear from Ahmadinejad in Iran when he has these so-called conferences, is what I would call hardcore Holocaust denial. There is also a form of Holocaust denial which we call softcore. And if usually hardcore and softcore is used in relation to another category of something else, I do that on purpose, because I think Holocaust denial is pornographic, both from terms of the Holocaust and as a historian. It's an insult to what we do and what we claim as history. It's not what historians do when the facts are against them. Just as a parenthetical thing, to think that there is a Holocaust orthodoxy, I invite you to any conference on Holocaust history, and you'll see people going at each other with a vengeance over issues of when the final solution was decided upon, who made the decision, did it start top down, did it come from the bottom, was it both at the same time, was this something uniquely German, as was made by a historian a number of years ago, and specifically German, or could it have happened anywhere? But that it happened is not something open to debate, because the Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. But what about the softcore denial? And we again in our seminar have heard about this in an extensive fashion. I'm just going to touch on it for a moment, and that is. And Juliana, if you want to add anything to this, you're more than welcome to. But softcore denial is where you don't deny the genocide itself. Of course it happened. But you either say things like, well, why are we hearing so much about this? Why do we keep hearing about the Holocaust? Enough with the Holocaust. Now, I hear that in my country sometimes. I couldn't imagine anyone saying that about slavery. But yet you hear it, in the sense of, as if to say, why is this being rammed down our throats? It's a genocide. It's one of the worst genocides in the world. There have been others subsequently. Never again has really turned into again and again and again. I just returned from Rwanda, so I'm painfully aware of that. You don't have to go to be painfully aware of it, of course. Or you say things irrespective of what your feelings are about the policies of the State of Israel. You may believe that the policies of the State of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians are completely wrong, illegitimate, unethical, not smart, not strategic, that they have no redeeming social value. But to describe what's happening to the Palestinians as a genocide is to denigrate not just the genocide of the Holocaust, but the genocide of the Armenians, the genocide of the Tutsis, the genocide in Darfur, many other places. Or to say the Nazi-like tactics of the Israeli army. Many times the Israeli army does things which are appalling, not just to its critics, but to its supporters, like any other army will do, and they're very disturbing. But to talk about Nazi-like tactics when you know anything about what the Nazis did is to both aggrandize the wrongdoings of the Israelis and, more importantly, diminish the wrongdoings of the Palestinians. To talk, as happens in my country, and maybe in this country as well, as the Holocaust, the abortion Holocaust. Or even as the PETA people do, the people who are protection and ethical treatment of animals. They will talk about the Holocaust of animals, which are used for research, medical research or product research, which of course is horrible, especially when it's product research, whether the shampoos burn or not or something like that. But still, to talk about it as a genocide, it's to borrow a term that Dr. Wetzel has used, one of my co-teachers in this course. It is trivialization in the extreme. So it's not denying what happened, but it's to trivialize. And it is very, very disturbing. I want to stop here, and I'll have some few moments of wrap up at the very end, but I'm happy to open this up to any questions that people might have.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Very much, Professor Lipstadt, for that overview of elements of Holocaust denial and how these can be challenged through academic research. It's always nice to know that you are relevant to the UK. I'm sure they call that impact. That's my academic colleagues here. So I would like to, we have about 15 minutes for questions. If you could keep your questions short and direct to give time for other people, that would be very helpful. So I'll open it up to the floor.
My. I could go on for another hour, but I'm sure they must be. We'll give a few more seconds for. Yes, please.
Is there such a thing as Holocaust obfuscation?
Well, it depends what you would mean by Holocaust obfuscation. What do you mean by that?
Associating the Holocaust with other genocides.
Oh, okay. That's a very good question. That's a very good question. And again, I'm very sensitive. I work closely with the Armenian community vis-a-vis the Turkish denial of the Holocaust. I've collaborated with them in the best sense of the word on many efforts. And again, the reason I was in Rwanda, just because I think it's important to note in the context of some of the things I'm going to say, is that there's a real issue of denial of the genocide of the Tutsis by the Hutu power people, who say it was just a civil war, both sides were equally guilty, we were all victims, we were all perpetrators, let's sing Kumbaya and be friends or something. I don't think they say the latter part, but that's essentially, they're denying that it was a genocide. Tutsis may have done things wrong in years past, you may not agree with all of Kagame's policies today, but that this 100 days in 1994 was a genocide is no question. So I think, there were those who have often argued the Holocaust is uniquely unique. It can't be compared to anything else. I don't think that's a functional argument to make, because if you can't compare it, you can't study it. You can't learn it. You can't. That's how historians work in a comparative, all social scientists, in a comparative context. I think there are, in many ways, in which the Holocaust is similar to other genocides and other forms of persecution which were not genocides. I gave an example to the students in our course earlier this week, where I talked about my experience visiting South Africa a number of years ago. And I went to the then Holocaust Memorial Center in Cape Town. It was then a very small, modest exhibition, and they had a picture of the pencil test. Anybody from South Africa know the pencil test? The pencil test, which I think where they would take with colored, where people of indeterminate, were they black or were they colored, particularly children, where they couldn't decide, and they put a pencil through their head, and if the pencil fell out, they were colored, and if the pencil stayed in, they were black, or they were black. I think I have it right there. So there's a picture, this horrible picture of a adorable little girl in a very pretty little dress, standing on a chair with these officials standing around her. She's obviously come to school, and they're putting a pencil through her hair to see what group she should be part of. And it's put next to a picture of a German doctor, a German non-Jewish doctor, measuring the nose of a little girl to see if she has a Jewish nose or not. So there you see two absolute similar incidents. However, I would say that as horrible, utterly horrible, nothing to qualify the horror of what it was like to be either a colored or especially a black person in apartheid South Africa. The white South Africans, those in power, were certainly not intent on wiping out the whole black population, because they needed them to produce the riches which they were living on, thank you very much, very well, the diamonds, the gold, to clean their houses, make their food and everything else. So where you see this is not as a means of comparative pain, whose pain is worse. This is by means of two things, and something I learned from another one of our instructors here. It's both because we owe if we're treating this as historians, we owe it to differentiate between things, A, and B. If people are working within the Holocaust for a moment, there were victims who suffered horrendously at the hands of the Germans. For instance, German male homosexuals. I would not have wanted to be a German male homosexual in the 1930s or 40s in Germany for anything. It was horrible. If you were caught, you were punished. If you were felt to be unrehabilitatable, or whatever the word is, you were sent to concentration camps, treated horrendously, often dying from your treatment, etc. But they weren't attempting to wipe you out. They wanted to rehabilitate you, so you would produce babies for the Reich. But if you were a French homosexual or a Polish homosexual, they could care less. So there are similarities and there are differences. I think that there are certain genocides. I think the genocide of the Tutsis and the Armenians probably comes closest to the Holocaust. But the Hutu power people who were out to wipe out the Tutsis in Rwanda did not really care that much about the Tutsis in the Congo, except as they presented a danger to them and their power in Rwanda. Whereas for the Third Reich, they were out to get any Jew they can. So that in, I think it's July 44 that they're in Rhodes, or it's August 40, very late, after Normandy, after the liberation of Rome, they take boats and they go to the island of Rhodes to deport a small Jewish community of over 2,000 years old, because they are so intent on deporting them. The war is lost by May 44, and yet that's when the destruction of Hungarian Jews begins. So there is a global intent, an intent of putting all the power of the state behind it, that I think renders this unique. Not in terms of comparative pain, but certainly in terms of understanding it as historians. Other questions? Yes, please.
I wonder, could you elaborate a little on the notion of softcore anti-Semitism or softcore Holocaust denial and current strains and examples of anti-Semitism?
Well, softcore, I think the examples I gave would be to, and what ties them together, and Juliana, please, if you want to weigh in on this, to diminish, to unfairly, not unfairly, that's the wrong word, to illegitimately make these comparisons, or to turn it around and turn the victim of the Holocaust into the contemporary perpetrator. And you do two things that way. A, you turn what they're doing today into this horror, and then you diminish what, well, they obviously must have deserved what happened to them, given what they're doing today. It is most clearly evident, but not only evident, in relation to the policies of the State of Israel and a way of attacking the State of Israel. And again, I don't say that as a blanket defense of the State of Israel. There are many things that you can disagree with, and which I disagree with, but to make this genocide Holocaust comparison is to turn contemporary reality and history on its head at the same time. But it's also the abortion, its treatment of animals. Any other examples?
The bombings of the cities in Germany.
Oh, that's right. That within thank you very much. Within the history of the Holocaust, to draw this equivalency, well, to turn Dresden into a Holocaust. You know, and or to turn the Hamburg or whatever, the bombings of the cities, so that makes it this again. What it is, we often talk about moral equivalencies. This is immoral equivalencies. They did wrong. They did wrong. So that. Yeah. In the back, yes.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about softcore Holocaust denial, is that the idea as well of Holocaust fatigue, like people being like...
Yes, I'm too tired. I'm tired of hearing about this. Why are we always hearing about this? Yeah, where no one would say that about, I'll use a local example, slavery or the potato famine. Could you imagine saying, I've heard enough about the potato, what happened? Be sure you've packed your bags and you're headed south, because you won't find too great. So that's the point. Now look, I am very careful, and you can look at some of the things I've written. I'm very careful and often criticize both people within the Jewish community, friends of the Jewish community, whatever it is, who will call anti-Semitism every time they see something. Sometimes things are not anti-Semitic. Sometimes they're legitimate criticism. Sometimes they're wrong, but they're not anti-Semitic. But this kind of Holocaust fatigue, I'm tired of hearing about it, has as its undercore, like, I'm tired of hearing the Jews be victims and that kind of thing. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What was the outcome of the trial?
Oh, okay. Thank you for asking. Maybe that's a good point as we near the end. The outcome of the trial, not in the sense of the Battle of Flanders, it was a great victory, I'll paraphrase. We won on virtually all accounts one small matter of use of certain documents in Moscow. And the material is all available on a website run by my, hosted by my university, www.hdot.org. It stands for Holocaust Denial on Trial. .org, and you can get the full transcripts of every day. You can get the judges, the judgment by the judge, which ran to I think over 300 pages. You look at the next to last part in which he devastates each one of David Irving's argument. Essentially what he says about David Irving's arguments that he misleads, he distorts, he lies, and he does it all on purpose. That was the point. That these were not mistakes. We all make mistakes. But there's no historical work I know by the finest historian that when it goes into its second or third edition, things haven't been corrected. David Irving, as we boxed him in with the information, well, you say you never met David Duke, leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Here in your own diary, it talks about meetings with David Duke. Were you lying then or are you lying now? And he said, well, I made a mistake. But if you keep making a mistake and the mistakes go all in one direction, that direction being exoneration of the Nazis, blaming the Jews, then it's not a mistake. I think I'm about to get the hook here. I'm very good at peripheral vision. So I want to thank you. Before we end, I want to just say that I think that this is an exceptionally important topic. At the same time, I don't want it ever to be said, and I say this full recognition of the important work done here by Holocaust Educational Trust Ireland, by representative of other institutions who are here teaching, who study and teach about the Holocaust, Imperial War Museum, other places, etc., that we should never think that we study the Holocaust or we teach about the Holocaust in order to fight Holocaust deniers. Even though Holocaust deniers are racist, they're anti-Semites and bigots, and certainly not historians. The importance of the history of the Holocaust stands on its own. Yet this attempt to rewrite history, to destroy history, to sow seeds of hatred, of contempt, is not dissimilar to the seeds of hatred and contempt sown 60 years ago. I'm not saying that the deniers are out to physically harm anyone, but you need someone to sow those seeds of contempt, those seeds of hatred, and others will use them to do horrible things. And I think that it behooves us, even as we study this history, teach this history, learn about it in and of itself, to be aware of this attempt to distort it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
For coming, and thank you to Professor Lipstadt.
Thank you.
And thanks to Holocaust Education Trust Ireland for making it happen.